The mud of Missouri was a greedy thing. It sucked at the silk of the wedding gown, pulling it down with the weight of a life Clara was trying to escape. Each step was a battle, a tearing sound of lace against bramble, of a promise being broken with every ragged breath she took. Behind her, somewhere in the rain-soaked darkness, were the sounds of men. Not the joyful shouts of wedding guests, but the hard, purposeful calls of hunters. Thaddeus Worthington did not take kindly to being defied. He was a man who built railroads, a man who laid iron tracks across the land to bend it to his will, and he had intended to do the same to her. Her father had called it a magnificent match, a union of new money and old land. Clara had called it a cage. The bruises on her arm, hidden beneath the fine Belgian lace, were a testament to the kind of life that awaited her, a life of quiet obedience and ownership. So she had run. She had climbed from her window while the orchestra played, her white slippers sinking into the mire of a spring storm, and fled toward the only thing she could think of, west. She paid for passage on a wagon train with the pearls her mother had left her, giving the name Sarah Miller, a plain name for a plain woman seeking a new start. For weeks, the name felt like a comfortable cloak. She cooked over open fires, her hands growing rough, the memory of Thaddeus's cold grip fading with every mile. The other travelers were weary but hopeful, their eyes fixed on the promise of gold or land, of reinvention. Clara wanted only to be forgotten. The storm that broke over the plains near the territory's edge was a different beast entirely from the one she had fled in Missouri. This was a wild, untamed thing, a monstrous fury of wind and water that turned the sky black as pitch at midday. The wagon train huddled together, canvas snapping like gunshots, but the wilderness did not care for their small caravan. A creek, placid that morning, swelled into a raging brown torrent, and in the chaos of the crossing, the wagon Clara rode in splintered its axle. The family she traveled with, the Dobbs, were good people, but they had their own children to save. In the screaming wind and driving rain, she was left behind. For 2 days, she walked. The pristine white of her wedding dress, which she had kept bundled in her pack, was now a tattered, mud-caked shroud she wore for warmth. Her false name, her carefully constructed story, it all washed away in the deluge, leaving only a girl, cold and starving, in a land that wanted her dead. Hope had dwindled to a single, desperate prayer. Shelter. It appeared through the gray curtain of rain like an apparition, a small, dark shape against the bruised purple of the hills. A cabin. It was little more than a box of rough-hewn logs, smoke curling weakly from its stone chimney, a flickering promise of warmth in the vast, indifferent landscape. She stumbled toward it, her legs leaden, her body shaking with a deep, consuming chill. She pounded on the heavy wooden door, her knuckles raw, but there was no answer over the howl of the wind. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. She could not die out here. With the last of her strength, she found a loose rock and slammed it against the small window beside the door. The glass shattered, a sharp, tinkling sound swallowed by the storm. She reached a trembling hand through the opening, fumbled with the inside latch, and pushed the door open, falling into the small, dark room. The warmth was the first thing she felt, a blessed wave of heat from a stone hearth where embers glowed. The scent of wood smoke, pine, and something else, something sharp and masculine, like leather and rain, filled her senses. She pushed herself up, her soaked dress pooling around her, and turned to shut the door against the storm she had brought inside with her. And then she saw him. He was not by the fire. He was in the shadows, a specter rising from a corner chair, so silent she had not even heard him move. He was lean, built of sinew and bone, his face a collection of hard lines and angles that seemed carved from the very rock of the mountains outside. His eyes, in the dim light, were the most dangerous thing she had ever seen. They were not angry, not surprised, just watchful. like a wolf's. In his hands, he held a long-barreled rifle, its stock resting on his knee, its muzzle pointed toward the floor but ready. "You broke my window," he said. His voice was low and raspy, like stones grinding together. It was not a question. Clara's own voice was a pathetic whisper. I was freezing. I would have died." He did not move. His gaze swept over her, taking in the torn dress, the mud, the wild desperation in her eyes. It was not a man's gaze, not the way Thaddeus or other men had looked at her, with appraisal or desire. This was an assessment. He was measuring her, weighing her, the way a trapper might study an animal to see if it was a threat. "There's a blanket by the fire," he said after a long, heavy silence. "You can stay the night. You leave at first light." He did not ask her name. He did not ask how she came to be there. The dismissal was total. He had judged her to be harmless, a piece of half-drowned flotsam washed up at his door, and he would be rid of her as soon as the sun rose. Clara was too exhausted to argue, too grateful for the reprieve to feel the sting of his coldness. She nodded, her teeth chattering, and stumbled toward the hearth. She shed her wet outer layers, her fingers numb and clumsy, and wrapped the coarse wool blanket around her shivering body. It was heavy and smelled of him, that same scent of smoke and leather. As she huddled by the growing warmth of the fire, she allowed her eyes to drift around the small, one-room cabin. It was a sparse, lonely place. A simple cot was pushed against one wall, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs in the center. But it was the other details that caught her eye. Above the door, on a set of wooden pegs, was a rifle rack. One of the racks was empty, a clean space in the dust, as if its occupant was long gone but its absence was still honored. On the wall above the cot, a single knife was sheathed and hung from a nail. Through the newly broken window, she could just make out a small, stark shape in the clearing outside. It was a mound of earth, outlined by a careful arrangement of stones. A grave. No cross, no name. Just the silent, patient stones. And then there was the man himself. He had settled back into his chair in the corner, the rifle now resting against the wall beside him. As he shifted to add a log to the fire, the collar of his worn shirt slipped, revealing a puckered, angry scar that snaked across his shoulder and disappeared down his back. It was an old wound, but a vicious one. This was a man acquainted with violence, a man who lived with ghosts. He did not speak again. Clara, her body finally succumbing to the heat and the sheer relief of being alive, drifted into a fitful sleep on the hearthstones. The rain hammered a relentless rhythm on the roof, a sound that should have been terrifying but was now a comfort, for it was on the other side of the wall. She dreamed of running, of the cold mud and Thaddeus's voice, a constant, menacing pursuit. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, she woke. The fire had burned low, and a chill had crept back into the room. She was not alone in her wakefulness. The man, Eli, was not in his chair. He was standing by the window, the one that was not broken, a tall, dark silhouette against the stormy grayness outside. He was staring out into the rain, perfectly still, as if he were a part of the landscape, as rooted and unmoving as the ancient pines. He was not looking for anything. She realized. He was just watching the storm, lost in a place she could not see, haunted by something far more terrifying than the wind and the rain. He looked utterly, terribly alone. When morning came, the rain had softened to a cold, persistent drizzle. The world outside the cabin was a wash of gray and brown, the trees dripping, the ground a thick soup of mud. Clara woke feeling as if she had been beaten. Every muscle ached, and a feverish heat was blooming behind her eyes. But she remembered his command. "You leave at first light." She pushed herself to her feet, her head swimming. The wool blanket fell away, and the cold of the room hit her like a physical blow. She found her damp clothes and began to pull them on, her movements slow and stiff. The man was awake, sitting at the small table, nursing a tin cup of what smelled like coffee. He watched her without expression. "There's coffee," he said, gesturing to the pot on the hearth with his chin. "Thank you, but I must be on my way," she said, her voice still hoarse. She had to get to Bitter Creek, the town the Dobbs had spoken of. Someone there could help her. She forced her feet toward the door, her body a dead weight she had to drag. She reached for the latch, her vision blurring at the edges. The room tilted violently, the floor rushing up to meet her. The last thing she heard before the darkness took her was the scrape of a chair leg on the wooden floor and a low, guttural curse. She came to in pieces, awareness returning in fractured moments. She was lying on the cot, a damp, cool cloth on her forehead. The world was a dizzying blur of the log ceiling and the hard face of the stranger. Swimming in and out of focus, she was burning up, a fire raging beneath her skin. And then she was freezing, her bones rattling with a chill that came from deep inside. Through the fog of the fever, she felt him, his hands, rough and calloused, holding her steady as a violent shiver racked her body. The clink of a spoon against her teeth, and the taste of a thin, hot broth he forced her to swallow. He moved with a reluctant, grudging efficiency, his silence a heavy blanket in the small cabin. There was no kindness in his touch, only a grim sense of duty. But he did not let her die. Beneath the gruff, silent exterior, there was a flicker of something else, a deep-seated instinct not to let the wilderness claim another victim on his watch. She thrashed in the grip of the fever, lost in a torrent of fragmented memories. She was back in Missouri, in the stifling parlor, her father's voice a low rumble as he sold her future. "Thaddeus will take good care of you. Clara, he is a man of substance." She felt the cold, proprietary grip of her fiancé's hand on her arm, his whisper in her ear. "You belong to me now." "No," she whimpered, tossing her head on the pillow. Let me go, Clara." She mumbled her own name, a plea to herself, a name she had not dared to speak for months. In his chair by the fire, the man's head snapped up. His eyes narrowed. Clara, not Sarah. He had known she was running from something. People like her, soft people from the East, did not end up alone and half dead on his mountain without a story trailing behind them. He had assumed it was the law. Now, he was not so sure. The name she cried out sounded less like a criminal and more like a prisoner. The fever did not break. By the second day, her breathing was shallow, and a worrying rattle had started in her chest. He knew, with a sinking feeling, that the herbs he had were not enough. She needed real medicine. She needed quinine from the general store in town. The thought of going to Bitter Creek set his teeth on edge. He saddled his horse, a big, rangy buckskin, his movements sharp and angry. He cast one last look at the woman on his cot, a pale, unconscious complication he did not want or need. With another curse, he swung himself into the saddle and rode down the muddy trail toward a place that held nothing but bad blood for him. The town of Bitter Creek huddled in the valley like a collection of driftwood thrown up by a flood. As he rode down the main street, a river of mud, the town went quiet, doors closed softly. Men on the boardwalk stopped their conversations, their hands hovering near their hips, their eyes following him with a mixture of fear and old, bitter hatred. Women pulled their children close, hurrying them inside. Eli kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, his face an unreadable mask. But he felt every stare like a physical touch. He was a ghost here, a reminder of a past they all wished to keep buried. The general store was a pool of light in the gray day. When he pushed the door open, the bell above it jangled violently, and the handful of customers inside fell silent. The proprietor, a balding man named Abernathy, froze behind the counter. "Eli," Abernathy said, his voice tight. "Need quinine and laudanum," Eli said, his voice cutting through the silence. Abernathy swallowed hard and began to measure out the powder, his hands trembling slightly. As he worked, the door opened again, and the sheriff walked in. Sheriff Brody was a big man, running to fat, with a mean, pinched face and small, cunning eyes. He and Eli had a history written in blood and regret. Brody hooked his thumbs in his belt, his posture a deliberate provocation. Well, look what the storm dragged in. I thought you learned your lesson about staying up on that mountain. Eli. Eli did not look at him. He kept his eyes on the counter. I ain't here for trouble. Brody, you are trouble, the sheriff sneered, his voice loud enough for the entire store to hear. It follows you like a stench. Heard you got a visitor up there, a woman. Eli's jaw tightened. News traveled fast in a place this small and mean. That your business now, Brody? Counting my guests? The sheriff took a step closer, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. It's my business when trouble comes to my town, and I won't have you harboring trouble again. Eli, you'll remember what happened last time. We all do. The air in the store was thick with unspoken accusations. Eli slowly raised his eyes from the counter and met the sheriff's gaze. The cold fire in them made Brody take an involuntary step back. Eli did not say a word. He placed the coins on the counter, took the small parcels of medicine, and turned. The other customers parted for him as if he carried a plague. He walked out of the store, the bell announcing his departure into the cold drizzle. He rode back to the cabin with a black mood clinging to him. The sheriff's words echoed in his head. Harboring trouble again. He had tried to help someone once before, and it had cost him everything. He had sworn, over the graves of his wife and daughter, that he would never make that mistake again. And now here he was, riding through the rain with medicine for a lying stranger who had collapsed on his floor. He found her much as he had left her, lost in the fever's grip. He mixed the quinine with water and forced the bitter liquid between her lips. He sat with her through the long night, the sheriff's warning a poison in his mind. He watched the firelight play over her pale face, the soft curve of her cheek, the dark sweep of her lashes. She was from a different world, a world of soft hands and silk dresses, a world that had no place here. She was trouble, just as Brody had said. She was a complication that could get him killed. But as he watched her fight for every shallow breath, something inside him, a part of him he thought had died and been buried under those stones outside, began to stir. He saw not just the trouble. He saw the desperation that had driven her to his door. He saw the fear in the lines around her eyes. Even in sleep, he saw a flicker of the same stubborn will to survive that kept him breathing day after day. The walls he had so carefully built around his heart, the silence and the solitude, had been breached, and as the rain whispered against the roof of his lonely cabin, Eli watched over the woman named Clara and felt the first dangerous crack appear in his resolve. The fever broke like a dam. One moment, Clara was lost in a burning, churning sea of nightmares. The next, she was floating in a cool, quiet pool of awareness. Her body felt like a stranger's, hollowed out and weak, but her mind was blessedly, terrifyingly clear. She was lying on a cot. A rough wool blanket was tucked around her chin. Sunlight, thin and pale, filtered through a dirty window pane, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. And he was there, sitting at the table, sharpening the blade of a large hunting knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on the stone was the only sound in the cabin. He did not look at her, but she knew the precise moment he registered her wakefulness. The rhythm of his work did not change, but the set of his shoulders tightened. "You're awake," he stated. It was not a question. She tried to speak, but her throat was a desert. A dry, rasping sound was all that came out. Without a word, he set down the knife and stone, rose and ladled water from a bucket into a tin cup. He crossed the room and held it out to her. Clara pushed herself up on trembling elbows, her vision swimming. His hand was steady as she took the cup, her own shaking so badly that water sloshed over the rim. She drank greedily. the cool liquid a miracle on her parched tongue. When the cup was empty, she handed it back. He took it, his calloused fingers brushing hers. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through her skin. He returned to the table but did not resume his work. He turned his chair to face her, his expression hard, his dangerous eyes missing nothing. "The fever broke last night," he said. "You've been out for 3 days." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "You talk in your sleep. Clara." He said her real name, and the sound of it in this desolate place, from the lips of this hard stranger, struck her with the force of a physical blow. The lie about being Sarah Miller died on her lips. Panic fluttered in her chest like a trapped bird. "Who are you running from?" he asked, his voice low and flat. "The law?" "No," she said, her voice a reedy whisper. My husband, he passed. I had nothing left for me back east. I was coming to start a new life." The lie was flimsy, pathetic, and she knew it the moment the words left her mouth. Her face flushed with shame. He stared at her for a long time, his gaze so intense it felt as if he were seeing right through her skin to the frantic, terrified heart beneath. He saw the lie. She knew. He saw everything. A flicker of something. Disappointment, perhaps, or disgust, passed through his eyes. "You lie poorly," he said. He stood up, his tall frame seeming to swallow the light in the small cabin. "You can stay for a few more days, until your strength returns. Then you go." He turned his back on her. A clear dismissal. "There are rules. You will earn your keep. You will not ask questions about me or this place. And you will stay out of my way." Clara sank back onto the cot, a wave of mingled relief and dread washing over her. A few more days. It was a reprieve, a stay of execution from the wilderness waiting outside the door. But the cold finality in his voice made it clear that it was nothing more. The days that followed were measured in silence. They moved around each other in the confined space of the cabin like two wary, solitary animals forced to share a den. The silence was not peaceful. It was a heavy, charged thing, thick with unspoken questions and deep-seated mistrust. Their meals were the most difficult. They would sit at the small table, the sound of their utensils scraping against the tin plates deafeningly loud. He ate with a hunter's economy of motion, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line through the window. She picked at the simple food, stew made from a rabbit he had snared, coarse bread he baked in a small iron oven, her appetite stolen by attention so thick she could barely swallow. Their conversations were clipped, functional things, stripped of all pleasantry. "There is more firewood to be chopped. The bucket is empty. It will snow before the week is out." He spoke of the land as if it were a living adversary, a constant threat to be watched and prepared for. And the land was brutal. It was a hard teacher, offering no second chances. The mornings were coated in a layer of white frost that crunched underfoot and bit at any exposed skin. At night, the wind moaned around the corners of the cabin, a lonely, desolate sound that seeped through the chinks in the logs. Sometimes, a chorus of howls would rise from the distant ridges, the sound of wolves, wild and hungry. In this place, the cabin was not a home. It was a fortress, a tiny island of warmth and life in a vast, uncaring wilderness, and she was trapped on it with a man who was as wild and unforgiving as the land he inhabited. As her strength slowly returned, Clara began to take on the chores he assigned her. She mended his worn shirts, her fingers clumsy with the needle at first, then growing more sure. She swept the rough plank floors. She kneaded bread. She tended the fire. In these quiet moments, when he was out checking his trap lines or hunting, she began to uncover the fragments of his past, the ghosts that haunted the silent cabin. One afternoon, while searching for a spare rag in a crudely made chest at the foot of his cot, her fingers brushed against something hard and flat. It was a small, tin-framed photograph. The image was faded, the edges worn smooth from handling. It showed a woman with dark, gentle eyes, and a soft smile. Her hair pulled back in a simple bun. A small child, no more than 4 or 5, was perched on her lap. A serious, dark-eyed little girl with her father's chin. A wife and a daughter. A life that was now nothing more than a ghost in a tin frame, hidden away in the dark. Clara's chest ached with a sudden sharp pang of sorrow for this man. A man she did not know, but whose loss felt as palpable as the cold air in the cabin. She carefully placed the photograph back where she had found it, feeling like a trespasser, a profaner of some sacred ground. Another time, while cleaning, she found a leather saddlebag tucked away beneath the cot. It was stiff with age, but a large, dark stain marred one side of it, a stain that could only be old blood. She recoiled, her stomach turning. It was a relic of some violent, terrible day, a day that had left its mark not just on the leather, but on the man who owned it. And then there were the medals, in a small wooden box, nestled among spare bullets and a whetstone. She found them. 2 medals, tarnished with age, their ribbons frayed. They were military medals, symbols of bravery from the war that had torn the country apart. He did not display them. He did not polish them. He kept them hidden in the dark, like a secret shame. This was not a man who was proud of his past. He was a man who was buried by it. Meanwhile, in Bitter Creek, the whispers grew. A solitary man like Eli, a man with his history, did not take in a strange woman without the town noticing. The story spread from the general store to the saloon, embellished with every telling. Sheriff Brody listened to the gossip. His old vendetta against Eli rekindled. Brody had been a depot sergeant during the war, a man who had seen combat from the safety of a desk. He had always resented Eli's quiet, lethal competence, and he had been the first to cast blame when tragedy struck Eli's family years ago. Now, the thought of Eli harboring another woman, another potential source of chaos, was a provocation he could not ignore. He told his deputy to keep an eye on the trail leading up to Eli's mountain. He would find a reason to pay a visit. Clara knew nothing of the storm brewing in the town below. She was caught in her own tempest, her waking hours a constant, nervous dance around Eli's moods, and her nights a battleground of memory. The locked door of her room in Missouri, the heavy, expensive damask curtains that blocked out the sun, the sound of Thaddeus's key in the lock, her father's voice, a day before the wedding, when she had shown him the bruise on her wrist. "You must learn to be more accommodating. Clara, a man like Thaddeus has pressures. This bargain secures our family's future. Do not be selfish." The word had cut her more deeply than any blow. Bargain. She was not a daughter. She was currency. That night, she had finally understood. She was not running toward a new life. She was running for her life. One evening, the weight of it all became too much. The sun was setting, bleeding purple and orange across the hard edges of the mountains. Eli was inside, cleaning his rifle. Clara had stepped out for a breath of the sharp, cold air, and the sheer, overwhelming loneliness of her situation crashed down on her. A sob escaped her, a raw, ragged sound. She pressed her fist to her mouth, choking back the tears. But it was too late. She sank to the ground at the edge of the forest, her back against the rough bark of a pine, and wept. She cried for the mother she had lost, for the father who had sold her, for the future that had been stolen from her. She did not hear him approach. He moved through the woods with no sound. One moment she was alone. The next he was standing a few feet away, a dark, silent shape against the fading light. He did not speak. He just stood there, watching her, his face unreadable in the twilight. Clara flinched, scrambling to wipe the tears from her face with the back of her hand, ashamed of her weakness. "I'm sorry," she stammered. He held up a hand. Stopping her, he looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, the hard mask on his face seemed to soften. Just for a moment, he saw not an inconvenience, not a liar, but a creature in profound pain. Her confession tumbled out, quiet and broken. "I didn't run from the law. she whispered to the darkening trees. "I ran from a man I was supposed to marry, a man who believed he was supposed to own me." She finally said it, the truth of it, the ugly, simple core of her flight. She braced herself for his questions, for his judgment, for the cold dismissal she was sure would follow. But it did not come. Eli was silent for a long moment, the wind whispering through the pines around them. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than she had ever heard it, and it held a note of something she could not name, something rough and protective. "You can stay through the winter," he said. Clara's head snapped up. She stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. It was not an offer of comfort. It was not a gesture of friendship. It was a statement of fact, a promise of sanctuary. He was offering her the one thing she craved above all else: time. He was giving her a season of safety, a shield against the world that was hunting her. Before she could find her voice to thank him, a sudden, biting gust of wind tore through the clearing, carrying with it the first hard pellets of snow. Winter had arrived. The cold snap was merciless. It descended from the high peaks like a wolf, silent and killing. The temperature plummeted, and the world outside the cabin was transformed into a landscape of white and gray. The snow fell for 2 days without stopping, burying the trails, isolating them completely. They were trapped. Survival, which had been a solitary pursuit for Eli and a desperate hope for Clara, now became a shared endeavor. Their proximity, once a source of tension, was now a necessity. The small cabin became their entire world. The woodpile, which had seemed enormous, dwindled at an alarming rate. They spent hours side by side, Eli splitting logs with his powerful, economic swings of the axe, and Clara stacking the wood inside, her arms aching with the unfamiliar labor. Their food, a carefully guarded cache of dried meat, beans, and flour, was now rationed. Every meal was a reminder of their precarious existence. The forced closeness began to wear away at their silence. They began to talk, not of the past, but of the present, of the strange track of a snowshoe hare outside the window, of the best way to bank the fire so it would last through the night. These small, shared moments began to build a fragile bridge across the chasm of their mutual mistrust. One night, the cold was so deep it felt as if the world might freeze solid. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the cabin groaned under the weight of the snow and the force of the gale. Despite their best efforts, the fire in the hearth burned low, the embers pulsing like a dying heart. Clara, huddled on her cot under every blanket she possessed, was still shivering, a deep, bone-rattling chill that she could not shake. She must have drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. When she woke, the room was almost dark, the fire nothing more than a faint orange glow, but she was no longer cold. A new weight, a new warmth, was covering her. She reached out a hand and her fingers brushed against the coarse, heavy wool of another blanket. His blanket. Her eyes darted to his cot. It was empty. She saw him then, a shadow sitting in his chair, closer to her now, keeping watch. He had given her his own blanket. The selfless, unspoken act of kindness was so unexpected, so profound, that it stole her breath. Slowly, tentatively, she reached out her hand in the darkness. Her fingers found his hand, which was resting on his knee. It was rough and calloused, a map of a hard life. He flinched at her touch, a sudden, sharp intake of breath. His whole body went rigid, a lifetime of guardedness, of pushing the world away, rising up in a single, reflexive motion. But he did not pull his hand away. He remained perfectly still, his fingers just inches from hers in the cold, dark cabin, a silent, trembling truce in the heart of the storm. The snow was a wall, a prison, a pristine white blanket that suffocated the world. It erased the trails, silenced the forest, and locked the cabin in a profound and total isolation. For weeks, the world beyond their small clearing ceased to exist. There was only the cabin, the endless white, and the two of them, circling each other in a space that seemed to shrink with every passing day. The forced proximity, once a source of unbearable tension, began to transform into something else entirely. It became a rhythm. The rhythm was in the bite of the axe as they chopped wood side by side, their breath pluming in the frigid air. Eli's swings were powerful, efficient, a fluid motion of muscle and intent. Clara, her hands now calloused and strong, would gather the split logs, her movements mirroring his, until they worked as a single unit against the relentless cold. The rhythm was in the scraping of a knife against a potato skin, in the soft thud of dough being kneaded on the small table, in the hiss of water hitting the hot stove. They cooked together, cleaned together, their bodies learning the dance of a shared space, a quiet choreography of survival. And in the long, dark evenings, with the wind howling its lonely song outside, the silence between them began to fill with words. At first, they were small, hesitant offerings, stories from her childhood in the manicured gardens of Missouri, so alien in this brutal landscape that they sounded like fairy tales. Stories from his youth on the plains, of hunting buffalo and learning the language of the seasons. They were careful, circling the deep wounds of their more recent pasts, speaking of anything and everything but the things that truly haunted them. But the walls were crumbling, eroded by the constant, shared intimacy of their existence. One night, as the fire spit and crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the log walls, Eli fell quiet. He stared into the flames, his face a mask of old, settled grief. The photograph of the woman and child, Clara knew, was in the chest a few feet away. Their ghosts were in the room with them. "I was away," he said, his voice so low it was almost lost in the crackle of the fire. "Trading for winter supplies. I was gone a week longer than I said." He did not look at her. His eyes were fixed on the dancing flames, seeing a different fire from a different time. It was a raid. Scavengers, not Indians, no matter what they say in town. Desperate men. They took what little we had. He paused, and his throat worked as he swallowed. "My wife, Sarah, she was strong. She would have fought them." He finally turned his head and looked at Clara, and the raw, unshielded pain in his eyes made her heart clench. "They found me on the trail back. I killed 2 of them. The other got away. By the time I got home—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. The empty rifle rack above the door, the small, stone-marked grave outside. They finished it for him. "The town," he continued, his voice turning hard, brittle as ice. "The sheriff. They said I should have been here. They said I was a coward for surviving when they didn't, that I brought the trouble on myself for living so far out. It was easier to blame me than to admit the world is just a hard, ugly place." He fell silent, the confession hanging in the air between them, a weight of guilt and grief he had carried alone for years. Tears were streaming down Clara's face, hot and silent. She did not know this Sarah, or the small, serious girl in the photograph, but their loss was a living thing in this cabin, a wound that had never been allowed to heal. Without thinking, she rose from her stool and knelt before him. She saw the scar on his shoulder, the angry, puckered flesh that was a testament to his own survival on that terrible day. Slowly, her hand trembling, she reached out and laid her fingers gently on the scar. A shudder went through him. His entire body went rigid, a lifetime of defensive instinct rising to the surface. She expected him to pull away, to recoil from her touch as he always had, but he did not. He closed his eyes, his jaw tight, and for the first time since she had crashed into his life, he let her in. He let her touch his wound. He remained perfectly still, a statue of pain, and allowed her simple, compassionate touch to be a balm on a hurt that ran so deep. She did not speak. She simply knelt there, her hand on his shoulder, weeping with him in the silence. After that night, the very air in the cabin changed. The last of the tension dissolved, replaced by a quiet, comfortable intimacy. They began to work together with an easy, fluid grace, anticipating each other's needs, moving as if they had been partners for years, and they began to laugh. It started as a small thing. He told a dry, funny story about a stubborn mule, and a real smile, a genuine, startlingly beautiful smile, cracked the hard mask of his face. Clara's own laughter, a sound she thought had died in her, bubbled up in response. Soon, it became a regular occurrence, their shared laughter a small, defiant warmth against the vast, cold winter. The snows eventually receded, giving way to a wet, tempestuous spring. The world outside came alive with the sound of melting ice and rushing water, and with the changing of the seasons. Another kind of storm began to brew inside the cabin. The easy companionship they had found was now charged with a new, unspoken energy. A shared glance held for a moment too long, an accidental brush of hands while passing a plate. The air between them grew thick with a longing that was as wild and untamed as the land waking up from its long sleep. One night, the sky broke open. It was not the gentle rain of a spring shower, but a violent, furious downpour, accompanied by roaring thunder that shook the very foundations of the cabin. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled, a mirror to the tempest that had been building between them for months. They sat by the hearth, the fire a pool of orange light in the dark room, the storm raging outside. But the real storm was within. Clara could not bear the silence, the charged space between them, any longer. She looked at him, at his strong profile lit by the fire, at the quiet strength that had been her shield, at the deep well of pain that she now understood. He was no longer a dangerous stranger. He was the man who had saved her life, the man who had shared his grief with her, the man whose smile made her heart ache. She stood up and walked to him. He watched her approach, his eyes dark, guarded. He knew what was happening. He could feel it in the air, a palpable, electric current. "Clara, don't," he whispered, his voice rough. It was a warning, a plea, a warning to her and to himself. She did not stop. She knelt before him, just as she had on the night of his confession. But this time, it was not comfort she was offering. It was something more. She slowly raised a hand and touched his face, her fingers tracing the hard line of his jaw. He was trembling. "I've never felt anything like this," she moaned, the words a raw, honest whisper torn from the deepest part of her. It was the truth, the fumbling, chaste courtships of her youth, the cold, proprietary intentions of Thaddeus. They were nothing. They were pale, lifeless things compared to the fierce, desperate, and profoundly real connection she felt with this broken, beautiful man. A groan was torn from his chest, a sound of profound conflict, of a man at war with himself. And then he leaned in and kissed her. It was a slow, hungry kiss, full of all the loneliness and longing of the long winter. It was a kiss of desperation and of a deep, aching need. His calloused hand came up to cradle her head, his fingers tangling in her hair. But just as the kiss deepened, he pulled away. He broke the contact with a gasp, shoving himself back in his chair, his face a mask of shame and self-loathing. "I can't," he said, his voice ragged. He would not look at her. I'm not fit for you, for anyone. Everything I touch, I destroy." He looked toward the stone grave outside, its shape barely visible through the rain-streaked window. "I'm poison. Clara." The cold rejection was a physical blow, but a new, fierce strength rose in her. She would not let him do this. She would not let him hide behind his guilt. She reached out and grabbed his chin, forcing him to look at her. "Do I look fragile to you?" she demanded, her voice ringing with a power she did not know she possessed. "I have survived my father. I have survived the man who tried to buy me. And I have survived this wilderness. And I am alive now because of you. You did not destroy me. You saved me." She leaned in and kissed him again, fiercely this time, pouring all of her gratitude, all of her longing, all of her own desperate need for life into it. This time, he did not pull away. The dam of his control, of his grief and his guilt, shattered. He kissed her back with a raw, desperate hunger that matched her own, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her close as if he were drowning and she was his last breath of air. In the crescendo of the storm, with the thunder rolling and the rain beating against the roof, they came together. He lifted her into his arms and carried her to his cot. Their love-making was not soft or gentle. It was a raw, tender, and desperate collision of two lonely souls, a breaking open of all their wounds and all their longing. It was the heat of the fire on their skin, the roar of the storm in their ears, the frantic, searching touch of two people who were finding in each other a reason to live. It was a beautiful, savage, and holy thing, a final, defiant cry against the darkness that had haunted them both for so long. The next morning, the storm had passed. A cool, clean light filled the cabin. Clara woke first, tangled in the blankets with him, her body sore but humming with a deep, quiet joy. She lay there, watching him sleep, his face finally peaceful in repose. The warmth of what they had shared enveloped her, a feeling of safety, of rightness, of home. But when he woke, the peace was gone. He opened his eyes, and when he saw her looking at him, a shudder came down. The warmth in his eyes was replaced by a familiar, cold distance. He sat up, pulling away from her, and swung his legs out of the cot, his back to her. He did not speak. He dressed in silence, his movements stiff and remote. Clara felt a cold knot of shame and confusion tighten in her stomach. The beautiful intimacy they had shared was gone, vanished with the morning light. It was as if it had never happened. He moved about the cabin, stoking the fire, making coffee, his silence a screaming accusation. She had made a mistake. She had pushed him too far. She had offered him something he was not ready to take. She dressed quickly, her hands trembling, the joy of the night curdling into a bitter, aching regret. The warmth between them had turned cold, the space between them once again a chasm of silence and mistrust. Eli walked to the window, staring out at the rain-washed landscape, his shoulders rigid. He stood there for a long time, a sentry at his post. Then, his body went still, his focus sharpened on a point far away, on the ridge that overlooked the cabin. "Get down," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. Clara looked at him, confused, and then she followed his gaze. On the ridge, a dark shape against the bright morning sky, a man on a horse, a stranger, watching their cabin, a tracker. And in that one terrifying instant, Clara knew her past had found her. The distant figure on the ridge was gone as quickly as it had appeared, a phantom vanishing back into the wilderness. But its presence lingered, a cold poison in the clean morning air. The brief, fragile truce of the night, the warmth of their shared passion, was shattered. In its place was the hard, sharp clarity of imminent danger. "Get in the root cellar." Eli's voice was a whip crack, devoid of any of the tenderness of the night before. This was a different man. The haunted homesteader was gone, and in his place was the soldier, his eyes cold and assessing, his every movement economical and precise. He grabbed a heavy plank that served as the cellar door, its hinges groaning in protest. "What? Who was that?" Clara asked, her voice trembling, the shame of the morning replaced by a raw, primal fear. "No time for questions. In now." He pointed to the dark, earthen hole in the floor. He was not asking. He was commanding. The shared intimacy of their bodies was a forgotten language. This was the language of survival, and he was fluent. She scrambled into the small, dark space, the smell of damp earth and rotting potatoes filling her nostrils. He placed the heavy door over the opening, plunging her into near total darkness. A thin sliver of light from between the floorboards was her only connection to the world above. She heard him move about the cabin, the scrape of a chair, the soft thud of a log being placed by the fire. He was staging the scene, erasing her presence. It felt like an eternity, but it was likely only minutes before she heard the hoofbeats. Not the frantic pace of an attack, but the slow, deliberate plod of a confident horseman. A shadow fell across the sliver of light. The cabin door creaked open. "That's far enough." Eli's voice was flat, cold steel. A different voice, laced with a lazy, confident drawl, answered, "Ain't a very neighborly welcome." "I'm not your neighbor." Clara pressed her ear to the floorboards, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Name's Rourke," the man said. "Just passing through, looking for a runaway. A woman, pretty thing, dark hair. Answers to the name Clara. You wouldn't have seen anyone like that, would you?" "I've seen no one." Eli's denial was absolute. A stone wall. Rourke chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "Funny. My employer was mighty certain she came this way. A man of means. My employer. Pays well for what's his. And she is most definitely his." There was a pause. The sound of a man dismounting, his boots thudding on the porch. "Smells like you got a fire going. Mighty cozy in there. Mind if I warm myself for a spell?" "I mind." The silence stretched, thick and dangerous. Clara could hear her own blood roaring in her ears. Rourke spoke again, his voice closer now, just outside the door. "You live alone up here? Friend?" "I do. Place seems cleaner than most bachelor cabins. Got 2 plates on your table, and I smell lye soap. A man living alone for as long as you look to have been don't usually trouble himself with lye soap." Clara's blood ran cold. He had seen, he knew. Eli's voice did not waver. "I like a clean cabin. Now, I've answered your questions. You can ride on." "I think I'll do that," Rourke said, his voice holding a new, sharper edge. "But I'll be back, and I won't be alone. My employer. He don't like to be kept waiting." She heard the man's boots on the porch again, the creak of saddle leather, and then the slow, deliberate hoofbeats fading into the distance. A moment later, the cellar door was pulled away, and light flooded in. Eli stood over her, his face grim, his hand extended to help her out. She took his hand, her body trembling uncontrollably. He pulled her up, his grip strong and sure. The moment she was on her feet, he let go, the distance crashing back between them. "He knows," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He knows I'm here." The reality of her situation, the fact that Thaddeus's reach extended this far, that his possessive grip could cross 1,000 miles of wilderness, settled on her with the weight of a shroud. Her time was up. Her sanctuary was breached. A part of her screamed to run, to flee on her own, to disappear into the mountains and spare this man any more of her trouble. He had saved her, sheltered her, and she had repaid him by bringing this danger to his door. But another part of her, a part that had been born in the warmth of the winter fire and the desperate passion of the storm, refused to leave. Losing this, losing him, now seemed a fate worse than being dragged back to Missouri in chains. Eli was already moving, his actions sharp with purpose. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the mountains. His eyes narrowed in calculation. The soldier had a new campaign to plan. "We can't stay here," he said, his back to her. "He'll bring others. The sheriff, most likely." He turned, and his eyes met hers. The cold distance was still there, but beneath it was a flicker of the same fierce, protective energy she had seen when she was sick. "At first light, we leave. We'll head up into the high country. There are old trappers' trails, places they won't find us." He was not asking her what she wanted to do. He was telling her what they would do. The word hung in the air. A promise, a commitment that defied the coldness of the morning. In that moment, he had made her choice for her. Their fates were now bound together. As Eli prepared for their journey, gathering supplies, checking his weapons, the gears of fate were turning in the muddy streets of Bitter Creek below. A train, hissing steam and smelling of coal smoke, had arrived that morning. From it disembarked a man who was starkly out of place. He wore a fine wool coat, polished leather shoes ill-suited to the mire, and an air of supreme, unshakable entitlement. Thaddeus Worthington had arrived. He did not go to the hotel. He went directly to the sheriff's office. He found Sheriff Brody leaning back in his chair, his boots propped on a desk littered with paperwork. Thaddeus laid a piece of paper on the desk. It was a telegram. He followed it with a second, a bounty notice, crisp and official, offering a substantial reward for the return of one Clara Abernathy, who, it claimed, had absconded after stealing valuable family jewels. "I am Thaddeus Worthington," he announced, his voice clipped and accustomed to command. "That woman is my fiancée. I have it on good authority she is being harbored by a man in these hills, a man named Eli." Brody's boots hit the floor with a thud. The name Eli was all it took. The old resentment, the simmering hatred, flared in his eyes. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for. A legal, profitable reason to finally settle his score with the man on the mountain. "Worthington," Brody said, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his face as he picked up the bounty notice. "I believe we can be of service to one another." Long before the sun rose, while the sky was still a bruised and starless purple, Eli and Clara fled. A cold, driving sleet had begun to fall. A final, bitter farewell from the tempestuous spring. It was not snow, but it was not rain. It was a miserable, freezing mixture that soaked them to the bone within minutes and turned the steep, rocky trail into a treacherous river of mud. Their escape was a brutal symphony of the land's violence. The mud sucked at their boots, trying to pull them down. Low-hanging branches, slick with ice, clawed at their faces like skeletal fingers. Every step was a risk, every foothold uncertain. One slip on the slick rocks could mean a broken leg, a cracked skull, a death sentence in this unforgiving wilderness. Eli moved ahead of her, a silent, tireless machine. He moved with a grim determination, his body a shield against the worst of the elements. He would test the ground before letting her step, would hold back a branch, would offer a steady hand to pull her up a steep incline without a word. The soldier was in his element, fighting a war against the terrain, and he would not lose. Clara followed, her body aching, her lungs burning with the effort of breathing the thin, cold air. This was a different kind of running. In Missouri, she had run from a cage. Here, she was running with the only freedom she had ever known, and the fear of losing him was a greater spur than her fear of Thaddeus had ever been. By late afternoon, they were both exhausted, their bodies shaking with cold and exertion. The sleet had not let up. Eli spotted it through the trees, a dark, sagging shape, half buried in the undergrowth. An old, abandoned trapper's cabin. It was little more than a pile of rotting logs with a collapsed roof, but it was shelter. Inside, it was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of decay, but it was out of the wind. Eli managed to start a small, sputtering fire in the crumbling stone hearth, while Clara wrung out their soaked blankets. They shed their wet outer layers and huddled together in front of the meager flames, wrapped in a single, damp wool blanket. The cold was a living thing, seeping into their bones. They pressed against each other for warmth, their bodies trembling in unison. The last of the distance between them, the last of the morning's awkwardness, was burned away by the simple, desperate need for survival. His arm was around her, holding her tight against his side. Her head rested on his shoulder, and she could feel the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the sleet drum against the remnants of the roof, All the fear, all the running, all the pain of her past and the uncertainty of their future seemed to coalesce into one simple, undeniable truth. She turned her head, her lips close to his ear, and whispered the words into the small, warm space between them. "I love you, Eli." The words were not a plea or a question. They were a statement of fact, as real and as solid as the mountain around them. She felt him stiffen, a sudden tension in the arm that held her. A long, shuddering breath left his body. He did not answer. He did not say the words back. The ghosts of his past still stood sentinel over his heart, and he could not let them go. But his arm tightened around her, pulling her impossibly closer. A silent, desperate answer that spoke more than words ever could. He held her as if she were the only thing anchoring him to the living world. The next morning, the sleet had stopped, but the world was shrouded in a thick, gray mist. The fire had died, and the cold had returned with a vengeance. They were low on water. Eli's canteen was nearly empty. "There should be a creek at the bottom of this ravine," he said, his voice a low rasp. "I'll go. You stay here. Keep out of sight." "No," she said, her voice firm. "Let me. You need to save your strength. It will be quicker if I go." He looked as if he was about to argue, but he saw the new, hard resolve in her eyes. She was not the same woman who had collapsed on his floor. The wilderness had forged a new strength in her. He nodded curtly, handing her the canteen. She made her way carefully down the steep, slick embankment, her boots slipping in the mud. The mist was so thick she could barely see 10 feet in front of her. She could hear the gurgle of the creek before she saw it, a ribbon of black water cutting through the gray landscape. She knelt by the bank, plunging the canteen into the icy water. The cold a sharp shock to her fingers. The world was utterly silent, muffled by the fog. It was a strange, eerie peace. The peace was shattered by the sudden, sharp crack of a twig behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. 3 figures emerged from the mist, their forms large and menacing. 2 were rough-looking men she did not recognize. The third was Sheriff Brody, his face set in a triumphant, cruel sneer. "Well, now," the sheriff said, his voice oozing satisfaction. "Look what we have here, just the little bird we were looking for." Clara scrambled backward, dropping the canteen, but there was nowhere to run. One of the men lunged, his rough hands grabbing her arms, twisting them painfully behind her back. He bound her wrists with a length of rope. She cried out, a single desperate shout. "Eli!" The sound of her cry echoed up the ravine. A moment later, a figure exploded from the mist at the top of the ridge. Eli! He was moving with a terrifying speed, his hunting knife in his hand. Brody drew his pistol. "That's far enough. Eli, it's over." Eli did not stop. He was a force of nature, a blur of rage and desperation. Brody fired. The shot was a deafening crack in the silent mist. Eli grunted, stumbling, a dark stain blossoming on his thigh, but he kept coming. One of the deputies raised his rifle, taking aim. Eli threw his knife. The blade spun through the air, embedding itself in the man's shoulder. The man screamed, dropping his rifle. But the delay was enough. The other man, the one holding Clara, drew his own pistol and leveled it at Eli's chest. "No!" Clara screamed, struggling against her bonds. Eli froze. He was 10 feet away, bleeding, unarmed, his chest heaving. He looked at the pistol aimed at his heart, and then his eyes met hers. The look in them was one of pure, unrestrained fury, and a terrible, devastating defeat. "Take her," Eli bit out, his voice a low, venomous growl. "But I'm coming for you, Brody. I swear on my family's grave, I'm coming for you all." The sheriff laughed. "You won't be coming for anyone." He nodded to his remaining deputy. "Get him." As the man advanced, Eli staggered backward, disappearing into the thick gray mist like a wounded wolf retreating to its lair. They dragged Clara away, her feet slipping in the mud. her eyes still fixed on the place where he had vanished. They put her in chains, and as they led her back toward Bitter Creek, back toward Thaddeus, the only thing she could feel was the silent, bleeding promise he had left hanging in the cold, misty air. The jailhouse in Bitter Creek was a small, suffocating box of heat and despair. It consisted of 2 cells, a dusty office, and the ever-present smell of stale whiskey and unwashed men. Clara was locked in one of the cells, the iron bars a cold, final mockery of the cage she had fled in Missouri. Through the single-barred window, she could see the muddy churn of the main street, a world that was now completely inaccessible to her. Time was no longer measured in sunrises or sunsets, but in the agonizingly slow tick of a clock on the sheriff's wall. On the afternoon of her first day of captivity, he arrived. Thaddeus Worthington stood in the doorway of the sheriff's office, framed like a portrait of righteous indignation. He had a small, tastefully stitched cut on his cheek, a souvenir from one of Rourke's men during the chaotic capture, which he wore like a medal of valor. His fine wool coat was immaculate. His polished shoes were caked in the town's mud, a fact that seemed to offend him on a deep, personal level. His eyes, when they fell on her, were not filled with concern or relief, but with the smug, satisfied glint of a collector who has recovered a valuable, albeit damaged, piece of property. "There you are, my dear," he said, his voice carrying through the small office, loud enough for anyone on the boardwalk outside to hear. "Safe at last. I have been out of my mind with worry." He did not speak to her directly, but to the audience he was cultivating. Sheriff Brody, his slack-jawed deputy, and the curious townspeople who had begun to gather outside. He approached the bars of her cell, his face a mask of pained benevolence. "Sheriff," Thaddeus announced, turning to Brody, "this is a sad day. In her grief and confusion after a bout of fever, my fiancée, Miss Abernathy here, was led astray. She departed from our home in the middle of the night, taking with her a substantial amount of money and my mother's pearl necklace, heirlooms of incalculable sentimental value." He shook his head, a gesture of profound sorrow. "She fell in with that man, the one you call Eli, a known killer. It is clear he took advantage of her fragile state, holding her against her will and further coercing her." The lie was so audacious, so complete, that it stole Clara's breath. He was painting her not as an escapee, but as a mentally unstable thief, and Eli not as her savior, but as her kidnapper. He was erasing her story, her will, her very self, with a few well-chosen, publicly spoken words. Whispers erupted among the onlookers. The story was simple, believable. A wealthy, respectable man from the East, a hysterical woman, a dangerous, half-wild hermit from the mountains. It was a narrative the town could easily understand. "That's not true!" Clara's voice was a raw cry from behind the bars. "He is lying! This man is a monster! I ran from him!" Thaddeus simply gave the crowd a sad, knowing look, as if her outburst only confirmed his version of events. "You see, the poor girl is not herself. She has been through a terrible ordeal. All she needs is to be returned home, where she can receive the proper care and rest." No one looked at her. No one met her desperate gaze. They saw only what Thaddeus wanted them to see, a fallen woman, a source of shame and trouble. Sheriff Brody, his hand resting on the bounty notice that promised a handsome reward, stepped forward. "That's enough out of you," he snarled at Clara. "You'll have your say in front of a judge back east. The train comes through in 2 days. You'll be on it." He turned to Thaddeus with an oily smile. "We'll keep her secure for you, Mr. Worthington. Don't you worry." 2 days. The words were a death sentence. 2 days until she was handed back to Thaddeus. Her escape a failure. Her future a black, bottomless pit. She tried to speak again, to scream the truth, but her voice was drowned out by the murmur of the crowd as they dispersed. Their minds made up, their judgment passed. Meanwhile, miles away in the mist-shrouded wilderness, Eli was fighting a different kind of battle. The bullet from Brody's pistol had torn a ragged, burning path through the muscle of his thigh. After staggering back into the fog, he had managed to limp his way into a dense thicket of pine, where he had collapsed, the world dissolving into a gray haze of pain and blood loss. His last coherent thought was of Clara being dragged away in chains. His promise of vengeance, a bitter, useless taste in his mouth. He did not know how long he lay there. He was drifting in and out of consciousness when a shadow fell over him. He instinctively reached for a knife that was no longer there, his body reacting with its last ounce of fight. A hand, old and steady, pressed on his shoulder. "Be still, White Wolf," a quiet voice said. "You bleed like a stuck pig." Eli forced his eyes open. Above him stood a man with a face like a weathered map, his long gray hair braided with beads of bone and turquoise. It was Joseph, an old Lakota tracker he had found years ago, near death from a winter fever, and had nursed back to health in his cabin. A bond of quiet, mutual respect had existed between them ever since. Joseph worked with a practiced, gentle efficiency. He cut away the bloody fabric of Eli's trousers, cleaned the wound with water from his own canteen and a poultice of herbs he gathered from the forest floor, and bound it tightly with clean strips of linen. The pain was immense, but the old man's presence was a calming anchor in the storm of Eli's agony and rage. For 2 days, Joseph tended to him in a small, hidden cave. He brought him water, broth made from a snared rabbit, and more of the healing herbs. Eli's fever broke, and the fire in his leg began to subside. With the return of his strength came the return of his all-consuming guilt. "I failed her," Eli rasped on the second night, his voice raw. He was staring at the cave wall, but he was seeing Clara's face, twisted in terror. "Just like I failed Sarah, and my little girl, I wasn't there." Joseph sat by the small, smokeless fire, his expression impassive. "You carry a heavy stone, White Wolf." "It's the stone I earned," Eli bit out. "If I had been home, if I hadn't stayed away so long." The old tracker was silent for a long time, watching the flames. "The men who came to your cabin," he said finally, his voice soft but clear. "The scavengers. I had seen their tracks for a week before the raid. They were not passing through, they were watching. They knew the woman and child were alone. They were waiting for the moment they were weakest." He turned his wise, dark eyes on Eli. "Your being there would not have changed the outcome. It only would have changed the number of graves you had to dig." Eli stared at him, the words sinking in like slow-acting medicine. He had spent years torturing himself with a single, unanswerable question. What if? He had built his entire miserable existence, his isolation, his cruelty, on the belief that his presence could have rewritten that bloody history. He had carried the guilt of his survival like a shield, using it to keep the world, and any chance of a new life, at bay. Joseph's words did not absolve him of his grief. The loss of his wife and child was still a raw, gaping wound, but they shifted the burden of his guilt. He was not guilty of failing to save them. He was guilty of allowing their memory to poison his own life. He had honored their deaths by ceasing to live, by becoming as cold and hard as the stones he had placed on their grave. He thought of Clara, of the warmth she had brought back into his life, of the way he had pulled away from her after their night together. Terrified of the very feeling of being alive, he realized, in a moment of terrible, painful clarity, that he had not been protecting himself from more pain. He had been hoarding his old pain, refusing to let it go. A profound change settled over him. The burning rage in his gut did not cool, but it was purified. It was no longer the blind, self-destructive fury of a man bent on vengeance. It was the focused, righteous anger of a man with something to live for. He had to save Clara not just for her, but for himself. It was the only way to truly honor the family he had lost, by choosing to live, by choosing to fight for the future she had offered him. He pushed himself into a sitting position, his jaw set. "I need my rifle," he said. On the night before Clara was to be put on the train, the heavens opened once more. A cold, relentless rain fell over Bitter Creek, turning the streets into a river of mud and washing the world clean. It drummed on the roof of the jailhouse, a somber, funereal rhythm. Clara sat on her cot in the darkness, having given up on hope, waiting for the dawn that would seal her fate. A lone rider appeared at the edge of town. He wore no hat, no slicker, and the rain plastered his dark hair to his skull and streamed down his face. He was soaked to the bone, a grim specter emerging from the stormy darkness. Eli rode not with the furtive caution of a man hiding from the law, but with the slow, deliberate purpose of a man who had come to collect a debt. He had retrieved his rifle from the cabin, loaded every bullet he owned, and strapped his hunting knife to his belt. He was limping, but his eyes burned with a clear, cold fire. He stopped his horse in the middle of the street, directly in front of the sheriff's office. He did not dismount. He just sat there, in the pouring rain, waiting. The door to the office flew open. Sheriff Brody stood there, silhouetted against the lamplight from within. "Eli, you damn fool! I knew you'd come! You're under arrest!" "I'm not here to be arrested. Brody!" Eli's voice cut through the sound of the rain, clear and deadly. "I'm here for Clara." "You're here to die!" Brody roared, drawing his pistol. Eli swung down from his horse, his feet landing with a splash in the deep mud. He moved with a stiff, painful gait, but he did not stop advancing. Brody fired. The shot went wide, the bullet thudding into the wooden boardwalk. Before the sheriff could fire again, Eli closed the distance. He slammed into Brody with the force of a freight train. The two men went down, grappling in the thick, churning mud. It was not a clean fight. It was a brutal, desperate struggle. Fists flew, landing with wet, ugly thuds. Brody was bigger, heavier, but Eli was fueled by a righteous fury that was far stronger than flesh and bone. He drove Brody's head into the mud, again and again. Inside the cell, Clara heard the gunshot. She leaped to her feet, her hands gripping the bars. "Eli!" she screamed, her voice a raw cry of terror and hope. The commotion brought people out of the saloon and the boarding house. Doors opened, and figures huddled under awning, their faces pale in the lantern light. The town gathered to watch the primal battle unfolding in their street. And they were divided. One man, a blacksmith whose child Eli had once saved from a rabid dog, shouted, "Give him hell, Eli!" and started forward, only to be held back by his neighbor. Another, a crony of the sheriff's, yelled, "Shoot him! Just shoot the bastard!" The fight raged. Brody's deputy ran out, leveling a rifle, but the blacksmith tackled him, and the two went down, wrestling for the weapon. The street descended into chaos, a swirling melee of shouts and struggles as the town's simmering divisions finally boiled over. In the midst of the turmoil, no one was watching the jailhouse. Clara saw her chance. With a surge of adrenaline, she threw her entire body against the cell door. The lock was old, the wood rotten from the damp. It groaned, it splintered, and on the third try, it burst open. She was free. She ran out into the street, barefoot, heedless of the cold mud that sucked at her feet. She saw Eli, his face bloody, locked in a deadly struggle with the sheriff. She cried his name, and he looked up, his eyes finding hers through the rain and the chaos. At that moment, the door to the hotel across the street burst open. Thaddeus Worthington stood there, his face a mask of pale, patrician fury. He held a small, elegant pistol in his hand. He had not come to fight in the mud. He had come to eliminate his problem. He raised the pistol, aiming it directly at Clara. "You belong to me!" he shrieked, his voice thin and shrill against the storm. Eli saw it, in a single, fluid motion. He shoved Brody away and launched himself toward Clara. He wrapped his arms around her, turning his body to shield hers, just as Thaddeus fired. The bullet slammed into Eli's shoulder. spinning him around. The pain was a white-hot explosion, but his resolve did not waver. As he fell to one knee, still holding Clara, he drew the pistol he had taken from Brody's deputy in the struggle. He fired once. The shot was clean, precise. Thaddeus staggered backward, a look of profound, aristocratic surprise on his face. A small, dark hole appeared in the pristine white of his shirt. He dropped his pistol, clutched at his chest, and collapsed onto the boardwalk. His reign of possession and control finally, irrevocably over. Dawn broke over Bitter Creek not with a gentle blush, but with the raw, weeping light of a wound. The rain had finally ceased, leaving behind a world washed clean and bleeding. The main street was a thick slurry of mud, pockmarked by the violence of the night. The air heavy with the metallic tang of blood and the cold scent of wet earth. In the center of it all, on the steps of the small, white-steepled church, Clara held Eli as his life seeped into the rough fabric of her dress. His head was in her lap, his face pale as bleached bone under a mask of mud and blood. The bullet in his shoulder was a deep, throbbing agony, a fire he was too weary to fight. He was conscious, his eyes open, but they were not focused on the chaos around them. They were fixed on her face. On the way, she tore strips from her petticoat with a grim, focused determination, her hands steady as she pressed them against the wound to staunch the bleeding. The terrified girl who had stumbled into his cabin months ago was gone. In her place was a woman forged in fear and fire, a woman who would not let him die. The townspeople emerged from their homes like prairie dogs from their burrows, blinking in the strange, blood-soaked morning. They gathered in a silent, watchful semicircle, their faces a mixture of awe, fear, and a dawning, reluctant respect. They saw the body of the wealthy Easterner, Thaddeus Worthington, lying sprawled and undignified on the hotel boardwalk, his fine clothes ruined, his reign of arrogance ended by a single, well-aimed bullet. They saw their sheriff, Hiram Brody, sitting on the edge of the horse trough, his head in his hands, his authority shattered. And they saw the two figures on the church steps, a tableau of suffering and devotion, the mountain hermit and the runaway bride, clinging to each other in the wreckage of the night. The silence was profound, broken only by the drip of water from the eaves and Eli's ragged breathing. Then, a single figure broke from the crowd. It was Martha, the blacksmith's wife, a large woman with kind eyes and hands as strong as her husband's. She walked forward, her boots sinking into the mud, carrying a wooden bucket of clean water and a stack of linen rags. She did not speak. She knelt beside Clara, her presence a silent offering of aid, a quiet defiance of the years of prejudice and fear that had isolated the man now bleeding in front of her. A moment later, another figure joined them. It was the town doctor, a man grown old and weary of patching up the wounds from bar fights and branding accidents. He carried his black bag, and his movements were slow but sure as he began to examine Eli's shoulder. Then another woman came with a thick wool blanket, and the blacksmith himself appeared, his face grim, and stood guard over them, his massive arms crossed, a clear signal that the fight was over. The town, which had for so long been a source of judgment and hostility, was, in its own slow, grudging way, beginning to mend its own wounds. Sheriff Brody finally pushed himself to his feet, wincing as he put weight on his bruised ribs. He looked at the scene before him, at the dead man who had brought the trouble, at the wounded man who had ended it, and at the woman who was at the center of it all. He was a man of simple, often cruel, calculations, and he could see the way the wind was blowing. The town had witnessed a kind of justice, raw and bloody, that his badge could not deliver. There would be paperwork, reports to the territorial marshal, but the truth of the matter was settled here, in the mud. He limped over to the church steps. He did not look at Eli. He looked at Clara. "He's dead," Brody said, gesturing with his chin toward Thaddeus. "His bounty notice is ash in my stove. You're free to go." He turned to the blacksmith. Get that man buried before the day gets warm." Without another word, he turned and walked back to his office. A man defeated not by violence, but by the undeniable weight of the truth. The days that followed were a quiet blur of healing. The doctor had dug the bullet from Eli's shoulder, and they had moved him to a clean room in the boarding house. He lay in bed, weak with fever and blood loss, and Clara never left his side. The town left them alone, a wide berth of respect and caution surrounding the couple who had upended their quiet world. Some whispered that Eli was a hero, that he had faced down a tyrant. Others still muttered that he was a killer, that trouble followed him like a shadow. But no one bothered them. The debt had been paid in blood, and Bitter Creek wanted no more of it. In the quiet, sunlit room, a new kind of intimacy bloomed, one born not of desperation and survival, but of peace and security. Clara would read to him for hours from a worn copy of Shakespeare the boarding house owner had lent her, her voice a soft, steady murmur in the stillness. He would lie there, listening, his eyes following her as she moved about the room. Their hands were always touching, a simple, constant contact, her fingers resting on his forearm, his hand loosely holding hers as he slept. It was a silent conversation, a constant reassurance that they were real, that they were safe, that they were together. When he was strong enough to ride, they left Bitter Creek. The town watched them go, two figures on horseback heading back up the trail to the mountain. But this time they were not running. They were going home. The cabin was just as they had left it, a silent witness to their frantic escape. The broken window, the cold hearth, the ghost of the tracker's visit hanging in the air. But it did not feel like a place of fear anymore. It was their place, and together, they began to rebuild. They worked side by side, their movements an easy, familiar rhythm. He taught her how to mix mud and moss to chink the logs, sealing the cabin against the wind. She showed him how to neatly patch the torn fabric of his old shirts. They replaced the broken window pane, and the new, clear glass let in a brighter, more hopeful light. They were no longer strangers thrown together by a storm, nor were they haunted survivors clinging to each other in the dark. They were partners, building a life from the foundations of the one that had almost been destroyed. One clear, cool afternoon, Clara took a small trowel and walked to the small, stone-marked grave outside the cabin. For years, it had been a place of stark, unrelenting grief. But she did not see it that way. She saw it as the resting place of the two people whose loss had carved Eli into the man he was. Carefully, tenderly, she planted wildflower seeds all around the stones, columbine and Indian paintbrush, hardy, beautiful things that could survive the harshness of the mountain. She was not trying to erase the memory of his past. She was bringing it life. Later that week, as she sat on the porch step, watching the sun set behind the peaks, Eli came and sat beside her. He said nothing, but took out his sharp hunting knife. He turned to the heavy wooden beam that supported the porch roof, and slowly, with great care, he began to carve into the weathered wood. The letters were rough-hewn but deep, carved with a sure and steady hand, C-L-A-R-A. He was not branding his property. He was making her a permanent part of the shelter, a foundational piece of their home, her name etched into the very heart of it. Spring deepened into summer, and the land grew lush and green around them. One evening, a gentle rain began to fall, a soft, whispering sound on the roof. A world away from the violent storms of their past, they sat before the fire, the flames warm and steady, casting a golden glow on the log walls. The quiet comfort between them was a tangible thing, a warm, heavy blanket of peace. He reached for her, his touch no longer hesitant or freighted with guilt. She went to him, her body no longer driven by fear or a desperate need for sanctuary. He led her to the cot, and in the soft, flickering light of the fire, they made love. It was not the frantic, desperate collision of their first time. It was slow, and it was deep. It was a rediscovery of each other, a tender exploration without shadows. without fear. It was the quiet, unshakable culmination of a love that had been forged in violence, tempered in hardship, and had finally, blessedly, found its peace. Afterward, as they lay tangled in the blankets, the gentle rain still whispering outside, Clara traced the line of his jaw with her finger. She thought of the cold, terrified girl she had been, and of the strong, loving woman she had become in this man's arms. She leaned in, her lips close to his ear, and whispered the words, not as a moan of shock, but as a sigh of profound contentment. "I've never felt anything like this." He turned his head, and his eyes, clear and free of ghosts, met hers. He brought a calloused hand to her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. "Neither have I," he answered, his voice a low, certain rumble. The story ends not with a final, declarative word, but with a new beginning. It ends with the two of them, months later, riding together on a crisp morning as a new spring dawns over the mountains. They ride not to escape a past, but toward a future. The land is no less wild, the winters no less harsh, the challenges no less real. But they face it together, two solitary, broken souls who, against all odds, had found in each other something that neither of them had ever known: the wild, hopeful, and finally, peaceful country of home. Thank you for gathering around the campfire with us for this story. Let us know where you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts.